Hello, welcome. All right, and so we're doing the time period of Andrew Jackson. They do they usually term it in great man history terms after the president of the late 1820s and the early to mid 1830s, and we'll go over why. So let's see here. Um, make sure that I have everyone here. Sorry I take so long doing this. Thank you for your patience. All right. Great, great, great. Okay, so let's go ahead and share the page with a couple documents. All right. So note, right, when they do Whig history, remember the Whig Party from the English political tradition, with the Whigs, right? They believe that society is and ought to be moving in a democratic uh, evolutionary pattern. That institutions like schools, government, of course, families are democratizing, and they ought to. And remember, the demos just means the people in Greek, giving more power to the people, becoming more egalitarian, putting everyone on equal footing, and allowing more participation by the common person, right? And so you see that in Andrew Jackson's time period compared to the generation before his, right? So first of all, what's really interesting is take a look, if you have a chance ever, at Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America. He was a French aristocrat who had come here to study the penal system with our prisons. And he became so interested and enamored with things American, he ended up publishing a book about his stay here. You have to recall, however, that he was here for a limited period of time. I don't think he saw more than 5 states of the Union. So you have to keep that in mind also, because he makes some very general claims in his book that are not universally accepted today. And one of such claims is made right off the bat in his book, as he says basically, one of the salient aspects of Americana that I perceive, he said, is a general equality of condition during Andrew Jackson's period. An equality of condition, right? That most Americans were about in the same economic spot on the pyramid. That a lot of Americans were humble owners of small plots of land and were transitioning from subsistence farmers growing their own food to becoming cash crop farmers to grow some type of commodity for profit on the market. And so then they in turn can make money and rise, right? The whole American dream. And he said, matter of fact, he said, Americans will build a lot and begin building a cabin. And before the roof is even finished, they're no longer satisfied and they want to sell that land and cabin and buy something bigger and better and move further west. And so he said he had never seen anything like it back in France, that Americans, their expectations, their sense of entitlement. He said Americans were so egalitarian that everyone thought that everyone walked around as his or her own, not only arbiter of his or her own destiny, but as like a rock star. That all Americans were like, hey, I'm going to get rich. I'm going to be successful. The world is my oyster, and here I go. And he said he had never seen anything like it back in Europe. And so he said, and some he does a lot of personal elaboration upon his observations. And so you come to see that some of the stuff, as we're going to get to later, especially, he was concerned about. He was not necessarily impressed by. He found it curious. He was, amused by it, but almost in a condescending or cynical way. But other things he seems to have kind of romanticized and thought, wow, this is something else. So this is one of those things, as he said, just the expectations of Americans to do well for themselves during Andrew Jackson's time period, he said, spoke volumes about the anomaly of America, how it was so different and unique as a land of opportunity, at least in the minds of the American people. So at any rate, you see that. You see that also in the log cabin culture. I didn't see that I had put that. It's a little bit redundant, A and C. I apologize. But with the log cabin culture, as he states that politicians, they no longer observed the old Federalist tradition of voting for your betters, your right, the better sort, as Hamilton exclaimed. Remember, you're probably getting tired of this analogy, but remember the analogy, right? That you believe perhaps that everyone is inherently entitled to the same rights and opportunities, but not everyone is equally capable of fixing your car. Likewise, right? It was the deferential notion that men of leisure, that men of education, that men with wealth, etc., had been groomed, so to speak, and better prepared to be politicians and to be elected as such, right? And so now you see a turn from that. You see politicians trying to project an image that was no better and no different from their constituents, right? Putting on a cowboy hat and trading in the Mercedes Benz and driving a Chevy truck instead, right? A lifted Chevy truck, and saying, hey guys, I'm one of you. I'm no different from you, right? And I kid you not, even to the extent a little bit of using the common vernacular and using poor, proper grammar with English, etc., right? And to me, it's a fascinating subject because you have the discourse on this. To what extent does that is that emblematic of? Is that a soil that is conducive for the development of demagoguery, where the well-to-do politicians and just politicians in general are manipulating the people, right? And you know, it's easy to put on an image, to put forth a facade, right, that you're no different from the common people, just to gain their votes, to gain their trust. But in reality, right, you could have your own agenda and you can manipulate public sentiment rather easily. And that's what a demagogue does. Demagogue knows the buttons to push, knows what, you know, kind of, you know, licks the thumb and puts the thumb in the air and sees which way the wind is blowing at that moment, right? And capitalizes on sentiment. And remember, sometimes that sentiment is in the realm of pathos instead of logos, right? It's in the realm of raw emotion rather than logic. And so if at that time, for instance, there is this wild, irrational, anti-Native American sentiment, then a demagogue runs with that, right? And makes a villain of Native Americans and says, they are the bad guy, I'm with you. Let's do this, this, and this against their best interest, but for our best interest, etc., right? And so a demagogue knows the buttons to push. But then to the other extent on the discourse is you have people saying, no, I think the politicians genuinely felt beholden to the people. And you have stats that I can get back to soon on the handout itself, on the argumentative handout, that demonstrate the increase in popular participation in the polls and voting. And it was impressive. It really was in and of itself. You know, you're talking about 20-something% of eligible voters voting, and that rose to 80%, 80. I mean, what's the percentage today for the presidential election? I don't think it's anywhere near 80%. And so at any rate, right, you have the degree to which, you know, politicians are afraid to put forth a clear-cut platform, right? Because they say, okay, if I go in this direction on this topic, I'm going to ingratiate this faction of people who are going to be in favor of my platform, but I'm going to alienate this other faction who are against my stand, right? And so you have a degree to which politicians were very nebulous, right? They're very unclear and vague and non-committal to some of their stands on certain topics because they were afraid of alienating voters. And so, is that alleged proof that the people, to a limited degree, began, it sounds too strong of a statement, but began to run the show, if you will. But Andrew Jackson comes in, right? And even his detractors who call him a demagogue, I find it interesting. They oftentimes, and I don't have the time nor all the research here available to me immediately to really satisfactorily prove this, but a lot of them take for granted the assumption that Andrew Jackson in particular was rather sincere in his platform and in his decisions, etc. That matter of fact, they even go so far as Andrew Jackson had a very a Manichaean outlook, right? Let's see here. Sorry, Andrew Jackson. I'm going to write that word up there. Some even go so far as saying that Jackson was a Manichaean, that you simplistically see everything in a bifurcated manner of good versus evil, right versus wrong. And you don't see any shades of gray. You don't see any nuance. It's just that simple in your mind. And remember also that type of Manichaean outlook, right, is tied, and oftentimes in the biographies, to notions of democracy and also to a frontier ideology. Because remember, Andrew Jackson, going back to this log cabin campaign phenomenon, a lot of them, what they tried to convey is that they had made it up. They had pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, that they had never been born with a silver spoon in their mouth, that they had never been granted anything to them freely because of name, family association, right? Wealth, but that they'd earned it all. And that was the common moniker of that time period, is contending that you were a self-made man, right? And so Andrew Jackson fit that paradigm very well. You look at his national or ethnic ancestry. He was Scots-Irish, and the Scots-Irish, right, were seen just a generation before, during the Revolutionary War era, as the scum of the earth, as the scum of Europe, right? And then before you know it, during Andrew Jackson's time period, it became the fad, if you will. It became in vogue to contend that you were Scots-Irish, saying, see, not only was I not born with a silver spoon in my mouth, but I was born behind the starting line, right? In the great race for the American dream. I was born at a disadvantage as a Scots-Irishman on the frontier. And remember, with the frontier, we had talked about this in colonial history, is the frontier was not as well represented in the state legislators, nor in Congress, arguably, up to this time. So they could claim, right, that the frontier was marginalized, also was harsh, and I'm pretty much referring, right, to Native American relations. Because after all, the Scots-Irish developed a nickname amongst the Cherokee and the other tribes of the Tennessee and Kentucky region. They became known as the Long Knives for their Bowie knives. Such was the frequency with which they fought with Native Americans to try to carve out land holdings and build cabins and plantations and a name for themselves, etc. Right? So when you look at the biography of Andrew Jackson, he fits the mold of being just the perfect, microcosm, a perfect mini example of this culture, of this time period. He was born Scots-Irish. He was born and at least brought up in the Tennessee frontier region. He rose largely through the most common avenues of socioeconomic ascension through land speculation, and yes, also through slave trading, and also by way of becoming a lawyer. And remember, you didn't have, not until the progressive era of the 19 teens, you don't have the sophisticated institutionalized avenue for lawyers yet. All you simply did was apprentice yourself to a practicing lawyer for a certain number of years, study under them, work for them, and then the bar could choose to accept you. There was no bar exam to pass, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very, compared to today, very informal avenue, right? And that's the way he arose. And so he was a man of his time period. You look at something as symbolic also, I think, as his duels, right? Remember with the Southern culture, with the Scots-Irish, their stigma, if you will, something as symbolic as duels. Look up the duels that Andrew Jackson engaged in, and it showed, right, that fiery temperament, that alleged quintessential frontier temperament. Not only duels, but fighting against the British. Because remember, the British, the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson's party, right? They continued long after the Revolutionary War, or War for Independence, whatever you consider it. They considered the British to be the symbol of the ancien regime, right? Of life before the Enlightenment. Everything that was wrong and backward with the medieval ages, right? They associated Great Britain with that. And of course, they embraced, to the contrary, revolutionary France as a model to follow, right? And so the fact that he fought so personally the British, he fought them, right, in the War for Independence. He fought them in the War of 1812. And he fought them in Florida in the Seminole Wars of 1818 and 1819. So, the fact that he fought the British, that fit the paradigm well. And the fact that he saw the British as everything that we want to go away from, as a land of privilege and an aristocracy, right? It was still with a king, etc. That fit the mold of his time period. And so his duels, his fighting versus the British, and of course his fighting versus Native Americans. Because remember, if you lived on the frontier, you were in intimate, immediate conflict with the Native Americans when you lived on the frontier. So all of that, right, led to a frontier image, okay, of Andrew Jackson. And then later, right, he was very anti-institutional. And that fit the mold for this culture that Alexis de Tocqueville creates also, right? Is that the idea that, what we use, this is long before, ideas of a military industrial complex, right, during the Cold War that Eisenhower warned about. But this marriage, this union between big business and government, they already somewhat are talking about that, although it couldn't have been, arranged in that sophisticated and in deeply entrenched fashion yet, for economic reasons and so forth. But yet that rhetoric was already there, that it was anti-institutional, anti-plutocracy, right? Remember, plutocracy is just that, the marriage of the wealthy businessmen and the government, right? And he carried that anti-institutional, if you wanted to look at an example of the anti-institutional, look at the Army. If we read a biography on there, he was very defiant and even rebellious as an officer in the army. Look at what he did in Florida. He was not given permission, you guys, to fight against the Spanish in Florida, and he did anyway. He was not given permission to kill prisoners of war that he said were guilty of fomenting rebellion and encouraging rebellion against Americans and killing Americans there in Spanish Florida. And he had some kind of, kangaroo trials and had them executed, some shot and some hanged. And so, like I said, just look at the Seminole Wars alone, and you find evidence of this anti-institutional bent. Now, he made a lot of enemies doing this, right? But to him, there seems to be somewhat of evidence of a sincerity that, again, that he had somewhat of a Manichaean worldview, that there is simply black and white in this universe. There's evil, there's good, and there's evil. There's right and there's wrong. And to him, right, coming from a frontier mentality, Native Americans posed an immediate danger to the, kind of WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American citizens, right? To him, the National Bank, right, under Nicholas Biddle, and the well-to-do Wall Street guys were parasites who were enriching themselves at the expense of the rest of the economy and the rest of the Americans, right? And those leading government and those leading the armed forces were beneficiaries of privilege, right? And they were not in touch with the common people. So when he made these defiant stands, right, there's evidence that he genuinely believed he was in the right and that he was going to lead the people in this great revolution, right, against these established interests that were almost nothing short of evil in his worldview. Okay. And so don't get me wrong. I want to leave a little room, some wriggle room, that there are some historians who still paint him in a very manipulative fashion. Okay. I'm not trying to say that he wasn't above dishonesty and demagoguery, but like I said, from what I've read, Pessin, H.W. Brands, I don't know remember if McCullough has one, if I've read a McCullough one on him or not, but I've read a handful, and they oftentimes depict him, these secondary sources, in genuine fashion, that he was a product of his time. He was a product of Scots-Irish immigrants, frontier man, who saw himself as a man of the people. And then, of course, right, not only anti-institutional, but of course, anti-aristocracy. And remember, aristoi means the best in Greek. So any type of institution where you had a self-appointed elite that claimed that they alone could make decisions on behalf of other people, he felt that that was clearly immoral and un-American, right? So for instance, the Senate of state legislators and the National Senate. So for instance, they would appoint, it was known as the caucus, they would appoint candidates for presidential election and other elections. They would appoint and decide. They would decide on the electors with our presidential electoral system, the upper house of the state and national legislators, right? He clearly was against this, and he wanted the people themselves, the citizens themselves, to make these decisions instead. All right. So, and then also the Supreme Court. You had, oh, don't fail me now, memory. I've read on this guy and I'm drawing a blank. The Supreme Court Justice, our textbook pays considerable attention to him as well. Marshall. Marshall made some very conservative decisions in his time period, right? He made the decision, right, that there are implied powers in the Constitution. So he wanted to stretch the powers of the federal government at the expense of the states, right? And he said that certain things are implied in the Constitution, but aren't explicitly stated. Because remember, if you're a good libertarian who hates big government, you're a strict constructionalist. That means that you're a literal interpreter of the Constitution. If it doesn't specifically state that a political office can do something, then it cannot and should not do that. And so he was the opposite. He was a federalist, right? He was conservative. And so he enhanced the power of the federal government at the expense of the states. He also enhanced the power of the judiciary at the expense of Congress and the executive. And remember, the judiciary is the least democratic branch of the government, right? These are handpicked old white men for life at this time. And he also made some big decisions on the rights of businessmen, and made some key decisions. You could find these in the textbook on the rights of businessmen with their contracts, with their property, etc. So he was very pro-business, right? So Marshall becomes basically an enemy to Andrew Jackson, because Marshall is the embodiment of the old aristocratic Federalist Party. So in he comes, right? So the nomination process changed, okay? So rather than state Senate, now it's to party conventions. All you have to do is join the Democratic Republican Party, because remember, the Federalists went kaput, arguably by 1820. Didn't even run anyone for office by that time. So you join the Federalist Republican Party. I'm sorry, the Democratic Republican Party, and you sign up for the local convention. It's to be publicized when and where to take place, and you can nominate anyone, including yourself, for office, and they elect democratically at that convention. And then if it's beyond the local level office, then the winners of that convention go to a larger convention at a somewhat more distant spot. And again, those winners are equally viable candidates in winning the next convention and the next one. So that theoretically now Joe Bob from Clarksville, Tennessee, and can become president. Okay. So the nomination process was democratized. Okay. Citizenship requirements, property requirements were dropped in virtually every state. Remember, Andrew Jackson didn't do this. He benefited from it. He approved it, but he didn't do this. This happened from state to state during the 1820s, but property requirements for citizenship dropped. Remember, it was the whole stake in society idea prior to this, that if you don't have something to lose, if you haven't become a property owner, you haven't proven yourself to be a responsible citizen. And that changed. And so now tenant farmers, sharecroppers, renters in the urban areas can now be citizens. All right, so the nomination process. And then, of course, the direct election of presidential electors versus the state legislators. Now the voters are voting on the electors, because the electors were actual people, right? So what California has, what, like 56 or something like that electors. It's a number of congressmen, one for every 30,000 man jurisdiction, and then 2 senators. So I think we have like 56 or so. So they were actual electors, and but now they're being popularly elected. And then, of course, not only the direct election of presidential electors, but popular participation. The percentage of eligible voters who actually came out to vote incredibly skyrocketed. I don't think that's even too much of an exaggerated verb. All right. So now you have all these parades, you have these rallies, you have people offering things to drink and people just getting drunk on election day and coming. And by the way, you would cast a verbal vote. So there was the degree of peer pressure as well, right? Because you could cast a vote for someone and you could get some boos by people and intimidating, social cues from people around you at the local poll. But there it was, in voting. And so, yeah. And then remember also is 1824 really set him up, presidential election really set him up for 1828 and 1832, is he won a plurality of votes. He won a plurality of electors. I think it was like 99 versus like 86. So he won by, 13, 15 points. And I don't remember how many, 1,000 votes. But he didn't get a majority. So what does the Constitution say? It goes to the House to decide, right? And the House decided on John Quincy Adams instead, and the second place guy. And John Quincy Adams, in return, has the Speaker of the House appointed as the next Secretary of State. So it looked like a, quote, corrupt bargain. And so that rhetoric of a corrupt bargain just ran rampant throughout the states for those 4 years, from the 1824 election to the 1828 election, enough for Andrew Jackson to win overwhelmingly in 1828. And not only that, but from 1824 to 1828, the number of state legislators that nominated Jackson was overwhelming, so that those in the Senate couldn't deny it. They had to put him on the poll to be voted upon. And then in 1828, his inauguration. John Quincy Adams' wife said, "Dear God, the mob has entered the White House." When he came in, you had, I don't know if it was hundreds or if it went beyond hundreds, but just people came in dirty faced, barefoot, stole furniture and silverware, got drunk, broke windows. It was a rowdy, raucous occasion. But to show the complexity of this, right? Andrew Jackson himself was disgusted by this mob action and distanced himself from the party. While they were all still partying his victory, right? And had likely voted for him, he was kind of disgusted by it himself and left early. So, the idea of him being a demagogue, it's still definitely there in public discourse. To what extent he genuinely saw himself as being a man of the people. Matter of fact, Richard Hofstadter, his book, American Political Tradition, I would highly recommend it. A great book. He has a chapter on Andrew Jackson, and he depicts him as a man who genuinely was of the people, but saw himself only as a man for fellow elite commoners like himself, if that makes sense. he's going to use a term called natural aristocrats. What do we mean by that? So remember, Aristoi means the best, right? So that they are not artificial aristocrats, and that some man-made society and institution decided that they have privileges over other people because of their family name and their bloodline, right? But that nature itself, that God himself has equipped certain people with the necessary qualities of leadership and vitality, right? That enabled them to rise up as self-made men, right? So I thought that was an interesting thesis by Hofstadter, contending that Andrew Jackson saw himself and was only for other people whom he perceived to be as natural aristocrats, poor white men who were highly motivated, ambitious, highly skilled, charismatic, and good leaders, right? So at any rate, and in his rhetoric, he was really big on equality of economic opportunity. Hofstadter covers this as well, saying that there were still some vestiges of privilege, right, in the United States that he wanted to abolish to ensure genuine, pure equality of economic opportunity. And remember, though, what we're talking about is economic opportunity for poor white men. For poor white men. So he was against the National Bank, the Bank of the United States. It had been chartered, the second Bank of the United States after Hamilton's had been chartered in 1816 for 20 years. So 1836, it came to an end, and he refused to sign its re-charterization, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so what did he do with federal funds? He encouraged them to be disseminated to local wildcat banks that would grant these loans to poor, white, ambitious men, right? Because after all, right, it takes money to make money. So whether you're engaged in land speculation, slave owning, cash crop farming, entrepreneurial pursuits of some type of business, you oftentimes need money at first. So that's whom he targeted as his voters and as his constituents and as his fellow compatriots, if you will, right? Like himself. He wanted to feed them credit. By the way, we're going to have a depression from this. That's going to be tied to this. But no matter that, right? He was giving the people what they wanted. And he claims that this was, the right thing to do again. Because I kid you not, in his quotes, he uses terms like the smile of heaven in many of his quotes, saying, right, that doing the will of the common citizens was his God-given duty and clearly the morally right thing to do. And then the Charles River Bridge case. Some Dartmouth guys claim that it was insinuated in a business charter that they alone could build a bridge over the Charles River. And some upcoming, right, poor white men along the kind of socioeconomic stratum that Andrew Jackson was from, built a rival bridge, and it went to Roger B. Taney and the Supreme Court after Marshall. And they contended that this is America. And if a group of hillbillies want to build a rival bridge right next to some Dartmouth guys, they have every right to do so, right? You have every right to build that Home Depot right across the street from Lowe's as a land of opportunity. So that was the Charles River Bridge case. Okay. So let's see here. However, when you look at the bad side to this, is again, right, his notion The very obvious, a limited franchise, right, of citizenship. Poor white men only. So did he push for immigrants? Did he push for African Americans? Did he push for Native Americans? Did he push for women? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. Of course he did not, right? So, tyranny of the majority. If the majority of your voters are xenophobic, right? They have a hateful fear and distrust of people outside of their own demographic, right? Then you give into that in Andrew Jackson time period, right? And that's kind of demagogue fashion. You're not trying to refine your constituents. You're not trying to broaden their horizons. You're running with the way they are. Racist, sexist, however they are as is, right? You're running with that. And so the notion goes, right, is sometimes democracy, right, by pure majoritarian democracy of citizens, right, of citizens only, can be like two wolves and one lamb voting on what's for dinner. And of course, you know, the wolves will outvote the lamb and decide to eat it. And so hence you see what happens with Native Americans. Thus, you see the political suicide that was involved of any form of elitism, having been born into wealth from the Northeastern faction, right, of well-to-do industrialists. Oh, goodness. The culture, according to Alexei de Tocqueville, crucified you, right? The worst thing that you could be doing as a WASP male was put on airs, right? Acting as if you are better than other people, that you're entitled to things that other people are not entitled to. That at this time period in the late 1820s and 1830s, that supposedly was tantamount to political suicide. Okay. So I want to go back to the actual document. All right. By the way, Pessin, this historian here, he contends that the notion of equality of condition is absolutely false. In his book on Andrew Jackson's time period, he said there was a clear dichotomy between rich and poor. That, yeah, you had your small sliver of Jacksonian people, of WASP poor white men who were gaining increased opportunities for the American dream, for attainment of it. But overall, generally, right, you still were largely remained in the same class you were born in. And there was still a pretty strong, you know, dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots. And then that goes into the discourse as well, right? As to what extent is Andrew Jackson, in order to gain votes, was he cognizant of that he was a member of a small cadre of poor white men who made it, but he wanted to feed that hope to his voters, right? In manipulative fashion. Here, vote for me and you could become like me, right? And again, the main avenues that he contended to help poor white voters was for access to credit, right, through the Wildcat banks, et cetera, and the death of the National Bank, and access to land, right? Because you could become a cash crop farmer. and go after that American dream. But land, whose land? Native Americans, right? So when you look at the War of 1812, there was a punitive tendency to dole out land taken from the Red Sticks who chose to fight against us in the War of 1812 in the Ohio Valley. So Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. From 1812 to the early 1820s, you had an exodus of poor white Southerners and people moving into that area, into the Great Lakes area. And then also into the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia as well. And it wasn't just the poor white men that were moving there, the wealthy land speculators, right? The land flippers, they tried to get involved as well, and they did. And they had all kinds of speculative sprees, if you will. But what about the Native Americans? Well, it's ironic, right, that in the Trail of Tears, you have 5 so-called civilized tribes that were known for their loyalty during the War of 1812. Neither were they guilty of participation in the Seminole Wars against us down in Florida. So there was no popular outcry against the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chippewa, the Creek. Although actually there was against the Creek. That was an exception. The Creek were largely Red Stick in orientation during the War of 1812, but not the others. And what do you know? What happens is they began issuing these eminent domain laws, right? So that is constitutionally given to the government, the right to say, right, that land that you are presently residing on is of a preeminent purpose for the republic itself. And hence we can force you to sell it to us. And historically, what has it been for? As we know to this day, hospitals, public schools, freeways, right? But in this case, they didn't even make the pretense of such public accommodations. They wanted this land for their voters, for their poor white male voters. And so the Carolinas, Georgia, they issue popularly elected legislative members on both houses, issue eminent domain laws against the 5 civilized tribes. But there's a problem, right? As you look at like New Echota, Echota, that land, that republic, that country, if you will, within the country, was granted to the Cherokee by virtue of national treaties from the federal government, granting them that land. You look at the McIntosh case of the early 1820s, and the McIntosh case, really kind of cemented what was already stated in the Constitution in a roundabout way. They made it much more succinct, is that Native Americans were a sovereign nation within the nation, not subject to state jurisdictions, and that they were directly the wards of the state, WARDS, right? And who else is a ward of the state? Orphans, prison inmates, right? So that one was that they're going to get them on that one, that status as wards of the state. They have Native Americans by the ears to this day on that one. So at any rate, the Native Americans took it to the Supreme Court. The Cherokee did in the Worcester case. And under the Worcester case, right, as you read in here, the Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee and made it about power, right? Their lawyer, William Wirt, was clever and making it about power. And he contended, right? If we okay these eminent domain laws, we're saying in the future that state legislators can abrogate, nullify, do away with federal level treaties. And of course, the conservative Supreme Court justices did not want to relinquish that power, right, to the states to be able to do away with a national treaty. So they said, no, a national treaty, the one that provided New Eshota to the Cherokee, is preeminent over a state law, an eminent domain law. And what does Andrew Jackson do? He directly defies the Supreme Court's decision and says that he's been given a mandate, a popular mandate, right? And you got to be careful because sometimes that's used as a very popular excuse and euphemism by demagogues, right? Popular mandate. I think of the Spanish language, right? The word mandato is a command, a popular command. He's saying, hey, the people have spoken in this by way of the state legislators. They clearly want Native American lands. And what they and I, at being a popularly elected president of the people, am therefore beholden to implement their command. Then in addition to that, he gives his famous excuse, right? Stating that Native Americans are unassimilable. They're unwilling and unable to assimilate, right? To drop their culture and become WASP, if you will, right? Kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American. Because they're unassimilable, conflict is inevitable. So he's using this slippery slope reasoning, right? Starting with a premise that's not necessarily true, that most of us would agree that is not true, and then sliding down to other causation arguments, right? Because the irony, if you read a book on the Trail of Tears, there was a reason for which they called the 5 tribes 5 civilized tribes. They became private landowners. They embraced a written language. They adopted a constitutional federal republic. The Cherokee did. They brought in missionaries and had their children converted to Christianity. Some of them, as cash crop farmers, even became slave owners themselves. So they were following the white man's ways. They became integrated into the markets and buying and selling products, right? And the Cherokee especially, some even engaged in miscegenation and interethnic sex or marriage. But nevertheless, this was his argument, that they were unassimilable and therefore conflict was inevitable. And that in that inevitable conflict, the white man would surely win because of sheer numbers and technology alone. And so therefore, as they were the wards of the state, right, under the direct protection and leadership of the federal government, it was the job of the federal government to protect its wards and to remove them for their own benefit to Indian territory.
Do you think that later what happened in Europe was affected by him and his policies? Because basically Europe did a lot of things later in the 19th century and early in the 20th century, saying almost the same things what he's saying, the popular mandate, taking away land from people who already had the land just for people and give it to people who voted for them, and basically ignoring everything that was in the Constitution, basically.
Mr. Virag, what is the name that you gave?
Oh, I didn't give any name. I said there were, so later in Europe, I
Oh,
see a
in
lot of
Europe. I'm sorry.
similarities. Yes. Do you think that Andrew Jackson's policies affected somehow later policies in Europe?
I
Just in
think that it is absolute, axiom that you can't question the connections, the similarities. And so therefore I think that it is absolutely worthy of studying. I don't know, like when you think of, Adolf Hitler and Lebensraum, right? A
well,
living
I
space.
think earlier. So in 1848, Hungary
Uh-huh.
started the revolution, and then
Yes.
after that, they were still together with the monarchy. But then, as the World War was coming, we were getting a little farther, and then our last king was basically nothing. And then who came after was taking away just land like this from people from the south and giving
Yes.
away for the voters. And that happened also in Russia. As
Yes.
far as I know, I didn't learn much about Russia. I learned a lot about Hungary.
Yeah, and I only know from reading books on American immigration when they get into the push factors of the Gilded Age of the 1870s to the 1900, when they get into the push factors that pushed a lot of the Southern and Eastern European immigrants out of Europe. But from what I'm limited in my scope of knowledge because I've kind of been pigeonholed into American history. I
Oh,
haven't
and
I haven't taught European history. I'm sorry.
I,
Uh,
I and I only learned European, so everything is new what you're teaching.
yeah. So no, I could empathize. But from the little that I've read as far as the push factors coming out of Europe, I absolutely I think you're making a lot of sense as
It
far as
looks like the
similarities.
Europe was copying this whole thing. What is happening? That they also wanted the lower class to have voting rights and everything, but they also didn't want to be that free in the beginning. And then suddenly a big change came in 1920, which is just less than 100 years from here. And then everything went wrong. With this Andrew Jackson, I see that everything could have gone wrong with that too, with
Yes,
this notion, because first the Native Americans came and it looked like he really didn't care about them. He wanted to please his voters. And then I just don't know how they didn't think that if they could do with the Native Americans, they can do it with anyone else later.
that's right.
So it looks like, but I don't know how it stopped. I'm hoping to read about it later. But this looks like that it could have gone bad, in a bad
Absolutely.
direction.
Absolutely. In an American historical context, they're going to run with this idea of the reservation, the idea of removing them for their own good, the idea of forcing them to sell their lands uh, because of this alleged incompatibility between progress and Native American culture. They're going to continue to carry it to deadly ends throughout the rest of the 1800s, in the Plains Wars, the Apache Wars, the Modoc Wars, etc., all throughout the rest of the West. So no, I think that's a great tie that you made, Mr. Virag. I wish I could give specifics. I wish I had a better command of European history. But I certainly sadly don't. It has been since the 90s as a student that I studied European history. And so I
It's a lot of
apologize.
kings. I hate kings all the time. We had to learn. We Hungarians had like 100 of them, and we had to know about all of it.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Well, I assure you, you've piqued my curiosity. Anytime I have extra time I'm gonna try to dive into that.
Oh, that's nice. Maybe me too.
I can imagine. So yeah, so I mean that's what we have here, right? And so hence at the top of the section, I say, right, more democracy, be careful what you ask for, right? That democratic evolution is not a panacea. It's not a direct, heaven on earth solution to our problems.
Well, especially if it's not really a real democracy because it's only for white men,
Exactly.
basically. So
Exactly.
if they really include everyone, it probably wouldn't go this far.
That's right. That's absolutely true, Mr. Virag. And matter of fact, right? I don't know if you noticed on most of the time, at least when I post this assignment, I will use the term alleged democratization.
Yeah.
Alleged democratization of Andrew Jackson's era. Yeah. Very good point. So yeah, are there any other questions or comments? Notice it's just a single section this time, right? But Alexis de Tocqueville, he wrote of this term right here, right? That you have to worry about the tyranny of the majority, at least the majority of citizens, right? Like you said, Mr. Virag, not necessarily a majority, but a majority of citizens can constitute a tyrannical faction just as easily as one man can, or one cadre of an oligarchy. All right.
They just have to know how to speak, right? How to speak to them.
That's right. Sadly, that is very, very integral. And with demagogues, absolutely, is oratory, right? Public speaking, charisma, knowing the pathological buttons to push. Absolutely. All right. All right, so anybody else? Anything else? You guys, can I get a thumbs up? You guys feel okay on this topic? Thank you. Thank you. All right, any other concluding comments or anything you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it.
Oh, not for me. Oh, I did want to ask a question.
Sure.
Will we ever see what we missed on the test, the second test?
What you meant as far as your score, or?
No, the right answers.
Oh,
It doesn't show in the end.
oh, I see.
Oh, I
Okay.
don't want to see.
You don't want to see?
I was so sick when I was taking that test. I was like, oh.
All right, I'm writing that down as we speak. So I will look into the properties that I could gain access to as the instructor and try to change that. And so that
The
it'll
others do
show the right
show, so
answer.
all of the others show. This was the first one that didn't.
I see. Okay. Okay, no problem. I'll be happy to do that. All right. So anybody else? All right. Well, that's it for me, guys.
Thank
I
you.
hope you found it a little interesting.
It was interesting, yeah.
Yeah,
I
it was
know you
very
guys will do
interesting.
well. Yeah, Andrew Jackson, very very polarizing president, for sure. All right, well then that's it for me, guys.
Thank you.
Well,
All right, thank you. And
are we having a meeting on Thursday?
you know what? As of right now, I'm planning to.
Okay,
Because of course we won't have next Thursday
right.
on behalf of Thanksgiving. So I'd rather err on the side of getting a little far ahead again.
Okay, super.
And so yeah, as of right now, barring a class announcement to you, I plan to do Thursday as well.
Okay,
That's
very
okay.
good. Thank you.
All right.
All right, see you then.
All right. See you guys. Okay.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.
You too. Thank you. Kaleo, Michael. Thank you.